out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
And why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too. Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation. Tonight, the peers, their lordships against the people, resumes over the safety of Rwanda bill as the unelected upper chamber takes its first blow to the Prime Minister's plan to make the deportation scheme effective. But is the Lords overreaching its legitimate authority? Meanwhile, in the Treasury, some good news could be on the horizon as government borrowing fell below expectations, with £20 billion worth of room for tax cuts on the table. However, a leaked government report has advised the UK needs more immigration to grow the economy. As His Majesty the King is told by the Queen to slow down amid his health concerns, I'll be asking if the King is simply working too hard. And as ever, to my cherished viewers in Scunthorpe and the wider county of Lincolnshire, don't forget to head over to gbnews.com because State of the Nation is heading to you away from the Westminster bubble next week on Thursday the 1st of February. State of the Nation starts now. It's Tuesday night, so it's my most theatrical panel tonight, barrister and former Tory MP Jerry Hayes and the author and journalist Michael Crick. As always, I want to hear from you. It's a crucial part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now, what you've all been waiting for, the news of the day with Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you, and good evening to you. Well, the top story from the GB Newsroom tonight, the Prime Minister says the UK will not hesitate to take further action in Yemen following a spate of attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea. Rishi Sunak described attacks by the Iranian-backed militants as illegal and unacceptable. It comes after last night's joint strike with the United States, which took place after a meeting with President Biden. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, said today in the House of Commons he backed the government's targeted action. Rishi Sunak signalled new sanctions too will be announced in the coming days, warning further attacks will be met with a response.
We are not seeking a confrontation. We urge the Houthis and those who enable them to stop these illegal and unacceptable attacks. But if necessary, the United Kingdom will not hesitate to respond again in self-defence. We cannot stand by and allow these attacks to go unchallenged. Inaction is also a choice.
Rishi Sunak. Now, forecasters are warning of more strong winds and heavy rain hitting the UK tonight as Storm Jocelyn sweeps in. The new storm's blowing across Britain with amber and yellow alerts issued for much of the country, although it won't be as powerful as Storm Isha. Yellow warnings for rain and ice are also in place across northern and western parts of Scotland. No trains running, incidentally, in Scotland tonight, with tomorrow's rush hour services also affected while ScotRail checks the lines. And drivers are being advised to postpone journeys and not park near trees. In the United States, Donald Trump says he expects his last remaining Republican opponent to drop out after today's New Hampshire primary. Polls point to a likely victory for the former president, but Nikki Haley has gained support and her exit is not guaranteed. Anthony Scaramucci was Mr. Trump's director of communications during his time in the White House. He told GB News that Trump lacks the temperament to be an effective leader.
There are 20 cabinet members that work for Mr. Trump closely and directly alongside of myself. Now, granted, I was there for 11 days, but I did work for him for close to a year on the campaign. And we all saw the same thing, and we were all speaking out against his temperament to be the president of the United States. So things do change, facts change, and smart people change their opinion when the facts change.
Anthony Scaramucci. Now, hundreds of people across the UK haven't been able to access their post after they were sent letters with fake stamps. A GB News investigation has uncovered that some post office customers have unknowingly used counterfeit stamps, leaving their recipients with a £5 surcharge. Fake first and second class stamps have been discovered for sale in Birmingham, Sussex, Nottingham and London. That's the news on GB News across the UK on TV, in your car, on digital radio and on your smart speaker. This is Britain's news channel.
Last night, the bilateral UK-Rwanda treaty, pivotal to making the deportation policy work, suffered defeat in the House of Lords after they voted against ratifying it. It is the first time the Lords has opposed ratification of a treaty, listen carefully, under Section 20 of the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act of 2010, and it's intended to add a further delay to a plan that was meant to begin over 18 months ago. Now, the real legislative meat of the plan is in the Safety of Rwanda Bill, which will come to their lordships soon, but this vote shows the mood of the upper house. In essence, it is rather, unsurprisingly, an attempt to frustrate and delay the government's migration policy, and it's been led by some very distinguished peers, one particularly who said something which we're going to quote in a moment, who claimed not to be an unelected nobody, but usually somebody who says they're not an unelected nobody is precisely that. Let's hear from him himself.
I have been offended by criticism, some of it aimed at me and others who spoke out on the Rwanda subject, that we are unelected nobodies who are simply put here to obey the rule of the democratically elected House. My lords, that is not our role. One of our roles here is to protect democracy, sometimes to protect democracy from itself.
Well, even Homer nods, because that was Lord Carlisle, one of the most eminent peers, an excellent legislator, perhaps best known for his important work as the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation. And he's right to say that he isn't a nobody, but he is unelected. And his remarks about protecting democracy from itself really seem to me very surprising. That is not the constitutional role of the House of Lords. Its role is to scrutinise detail and process and to try to ensure that legislation is competent. Posing the underlying politics of legislation is not really what it's there for. It's more there to delve into the fine print. And under the Salisbury-Addison Convention, the House of Lords is not meant to block legislation, at least at second reading, that is in elected parties' manifestos, and reducing immigration was in the 29 manifesto. So the real question is the House of Lords on thin ice? There was a big attempt to reform it under the coalition. There's a feeling that appointed peers don't have legitimacy, and it's got much more deeply involved in the weeds of politics, particularly conservative politics, in recent years. Is this something that a democracy can cope with, or are the benefits of the House of Lords still sufficient to outweigh this obstacle, this disadvantage? As always, I want to hear from you, mailmog@gbnews.com. Joining me now is the United Kingdom's first and primary constitutional expert, Sir Vernon Bogdanor, and Michael Crick, our panellist, is also with me to discuss this. Vernon, first of all, thank you very much for coming in. The first question for you is on CRAG, the Constitutional Reform Act, being used for the first time. What's the effect of this, and how important an act was it when it was brought in?
Well, this is a very important point, because no Parliament has rejected a treaty since the 19th century, and a treaty is an executive act which the government negotiates with another government, in this case, the government of Rwanda. Now, how can a government negotiate if it can't be sure that it will carry what it negotiates through Parliament? Now, a government can be sure on the whole that its own MPs will support it. Most of our governments are majority governments. But of course, it can't be sure that the Lords would support it. And I think it should be able to be sure that the Lords will support a treaty. There's a different question about the legislation, but a treaty, I think it does go beyond the remit of the Lords to reject that.
And this is an important part of our dualist legal system, isn't it? That the treaty is valid in international law between the UK and Rwanda, but its consequences in domestic law need an Act of Parliament. And it is fair for the House of Lords to amend the Act of Parliament, but it is interfering with the executive and the executive with a democratic mandate if it rejects a treaty.
That's absolutely right, and that situation occurred quite often with treaties when we were in the European Union, because many in the Commons wanted to reject various treaties, but the Lords, to my knowledge, never did. So I think it does go a bit beyond the function of the Lords to reject a treaty, and arguably the Commons as well, but certainly the Lords.
Certainly the Lords. And do you think it's indicative of where the Lords is intending to go with the Rwanda bill, or should we not read too much into it?
The Lords does have rights over the Rwanda bill. Broadly speaking, the role of the Lords is to ask the government in certain circumstances to think again, but it has no right to stop a determined government. So I suspect the Lords will not reject the bill on second reading, but they will pass various amendments, which I suspect the Commons will reject. And then the Lords should not insist on their amendments, but let the government have its way. And also the Lords should not filibuster. There's a convention. It should deal with government legislation within a reasonable time.
And then worry about this rejection of the treaty is that it gives it the opportunity to delay, to say until the government has responded to the motion they passed yesterday, it shouldn't deal with the legislation, and that it is potentially an argument for, as you say, an attempted filibuster.
Yes, absolutely. And the government, no doubt, will reject what the Lords are saying, and then the Lords should give way. My suspicion is that they will give way, and I think they'd be very foolish not to do so.
And to what extent do you feel, as I do, that the Lords, actually since the hereditaries went, has felt itself to be more legitimate and therefore has been bolder in challenging the government of the day, both actually the Blair government in the end and particularly since we've had Conservative governments from 2015.
Well, that is absolutely right. The more you rationalise the composition of the Lords, the more legitimacy it feels it has. And that's one of the arguments, perhaps, against the democratically elected Lords. It would feel that it was at least as legitimate as the House of Commons. Now, there's a very careful balance in the Lords, as I said a few moments ago, to ask the government to think again, but not do more than that. And that is the rationale for a second revising, scrutinising chamber.
Michael, do you feel that the Lords is going beyond what it ought to be doing, or that actually having a more powerful Lords is beneficial constitutionally?
Well, I do think actually in the last few decades, I think increasingly the Lords has tidied up and spotted the flaws and corrected, and governments have, often as a result of corrected, flawed legislation at a time when increasingly the passage of legislation through the Commons has been timetabled and therefore it's not had proper scrutiny from MPs. So they've done a really useful job in that respect. But I recognise it's shaky ground. You still have, despite what you said earlier, you still have, 90 or so hereditaries in the Lords and these absurd by-elections every now and then. There's a whole load of Lords who, frankly, bought their peerages by making donations to political parties, particularly yours. And so the whole thing is utterly unsatisfactory. But I'm pleased that the Lords have voted this way last night. I hope they will delay and scrutinise and persuade the government to correct the whole Rwanda package, because I think the Rwanda package is flawed, because I think that Rwanda is the wrong place. I've got nothing in principle against the idea of sending immigrants who come across the Channel to somewhere else to be processed and dealt with. But I don't think Rwanda's the right place, given its human rights record.
Well, Michael makes a very good point about the revising aspect of the Lords, and sitting in the Commons does not scrutinise legislation well. The thing that worries me about the Lords' scrutiny of legislation is that it scrutinises it more carefully if it doesn't like it. So bills that meet the approval of the consensus of the Lords, like the Energy Bill, got through with extraordinary powers for the government without much qualification at all. Ones that the Lords doesn't like, it's very different. And I just worry that the Lords has become too obviously party political.
Well, that may be, and I have to say I share Michael's view about the Rwanda bill. I have a lot of qualms about it. But in a sense, my position and Michael's position are irrelevant because we are not elected. The government was elected, and I think the question of whether the Rwanda bill is a good bill or not should be left for the people to decide in a general election. The Labour Party has said it will repeal the bill if it gets to power, and I think the Lords shouldn't prevent that happening. It's not for the Lords to say this is not a good bill, it's for the government and, in the last resort, the people, the voters, to say whether this is something they want to go ahead.
Final thought from both of you. The 1911 Parliament Act says it's a temporary measure till we have a new formed House of Lords. In another 100 years, do you think it will still be primarily appointed?
Yes, I do. We've got the best of all worlds. We've got a unicameral system with 2 chambers.
Michael?
I suspect not. No, I think there will be changes, and it may only be half elected or something. But I mean, it's done bit by bit.
Thank you to both my guests. Vernon's braver than I am because he said that Michael's view was irrelevant, which is something I've never dared say. Coming up next,
I said my view was irrelevant as well.
Coming up next, do you think Britain needs even more immigration? A leaked Treasury report suggests so. Plus, do we need some more members of the royal family to help support the King?
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's live here on GB News. Every Wednesday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox,
That's right, we want to hear from you,
GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Wake up to the headlines with headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is still State of the Nation. We've been discussing the recalcitrant House of Lords, and you've been sending in your mail mogs. Elizabeth says, the House of Lords worked well when it was hereditary with the addition of necessary specialists. Since being stuffed by Blair and Clegg, its powers have been severely abused. Instead of helpfully and positively scrutinising legislation sent up by the lower house, it is now trying to change and overthrow government policy. In this case, they are doing it to stop the Conservatives from winning an election. Judith says, hi Jacob, Rishi Sunak should tell the unelected House of Lords that he is going to offer the public a referendum on whether to abolish them, play them at their own game, too many vested interests in there. Well, there may be some good news on the horizon. I know, telly bringing you good news, owing to the fact that the government's borrowing has halved the year on year, with headroom of about £20 billion. This means we could be looking at some significant tax cuts in the budget in March this year. Nonetheless, we all know that debt to GDP is still high and interest payments are one of the largest items in the budget, so there's not an enormous amount of room, whatever you think of it. But the Prime Minister has been right, surely, to adopt fiscal responsibility. It was one of his 5 pledges to reduce the debt. And this December, the deficit, bear in mind, the deficit is annual. The debt is the total stock of debt built up over decades, indeed centuries. But the deficit was more than £16 billion lower than the Office Budget Responsibility predicted. Incompetent, as always, the OBR. So I'm joined now by my distinguished panel, former barrister, current barrister and former Tory MP Jerry Hayes, and the author and broadcaster Michael Crick. So, Michael, tax cuts, whoopee.
Bribes. Bribes. Yes, I mean, a constitutional expert like you will know, of course, that it's illegal to bribe the voters.
Yes.
And it's illegal, and indeed the legislation was strengthened not that long ago. The bribery legislation was strengthened, and that's what we're talking about here, the possibility that Jeremy Hunt will come out and bribe the electors. But the electors are not fools. They'll know what's happening, and they'll know full well, as has often happened in the past, that in the very unlikely event the Conservatives are returned at the election, there'll be a pretty quick budget straight away after, and new taxes will be imposed, as happened in 1992.
And indeed in 1954, I think, when the tax was cut by Rab Butler immediately before the election and then put straight back up afterwards. I mean, this has happened, but you can't bribe people with their own money, can you? Just technically.
Yes, well, you can.
How do you bribe people with their own money?
No, for heaven's sake, I'm a barrister. It costs you 100 guineas.
Yes, but that's not... paying you your fee is not bribing you.
No, it's not. But never mind. Go back to him.
No, I'm quite interested in your view. Do you want to see tax cuts coming through? Do you think this means we
I want to see tax cuts which do not result in inflation. Too much money, taking too few goods, too many... You know the thing.
Yes.
But the problem we've got at the moment is that this government is obsessed with tax cuts. If it increases growth, then we're all in favour of it. But if it's chasing inflation, it's utter madness.
Any government that has tax at the highest level for 70 years be looking for tax cuts?
Of course.
Doesn't this have to go hand in hand?
Of course.
To the point I was making earlier about Sunak's fiscal responsibility, cutting the size of the state, not spending too much money.
This is what Tories believe in. We actually believe in tax cuts. Labour doesn't. We are doing our best to reduce taxes. All very well and good. But we can't increase inflation. Now, what we should do is look at stamp duty. Stamp duty is something no one ever talks about, but it is opposition to people buying their own homes.
Actually, I have talked about it and written articles on stamp duty.
Yes, and you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
Most efficient tax.
But we cannot have inflationary tax.
What would you call an inflation? Michael, what would you call an inflationary tax?
There. You're sitting there talking about tax cuts with no recognition of the fact that dozens, perhaps scores of councils, Conservative and Labour, are on the point of going bankrupt. Some already have.
Yeah.
Universities are on the point of going bankrupt. The criminal justice system is falling apart.
It's fallen apart.
Has fallen apart. There are all sorts of parts of the state where you will be cutting the size of the state simply by bankruptcy.
We should cut councils because there are a lot of useless councils that spend too much money.
I think actually councils are rather good at
wasting money.
Well, central government wastes money as well.
Yeah,
but a lot of councils are rather good at husbanding their money. It's just that they've been squeezed and squeezed and squeezed and had more and more responsibilities thrust on them. And look at the social care system. It's falling apart. They can't afford to pay people a decent rate to recruit enough people. That's the sort of thing we should be talking about, not bribes for voters.
Pause there. Bribes for voters is not bribes for voters. Voters want to feel better. They want to have more money in their pockets, which is really important.
They want confidence that their parents will be looked after in social care.
Yeah, but how do we do it? And that's the problem for the government. Do we put money in their pockets by income tax? Ridiculous. Absolutely insane. Do we do it with VAT? Well, of course you can't. At the end of the day, how does the government actually do it?
I think this is all an attempt. Now, the Conservatives know that they're finished and they're going into opposition. And this is an attempt by Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak and the High Command to lay waste parts of the public sector by giving out tax cuts, putting Labour on the spot. And when they come into power and posing the question, will Labour reverse those tax cuts and making it harder for Labour to deal with the problems?
You don't really believe that for a moment. You don't believe that people go into politics to have a scorched earth strategy. You certainly accept that politicians may make mistakes, but you're massively overstating, Michael.
You have now revealed yourself in the last 12 months or so as a believer in electoral tricks. And this is one of those electoral tricks whereby you're doing something to put your opposition on the spot.
Precise opposite. I revealed myself as not liking electoral tricks because they don't work.
You were all in favour of you came out and revealed you were in favour of that, of the legislation introducing IDs at elections.
I said exactly the reverse. I said I wasn't in favour of it because I thought it was an electoral trick that wouldn't work.
Well, in that
which
case,
is exactly what it turned out to be.
I stand corrected,
but I
withdraw what I've just said.
I was in government at the time, so I was bound by collective responsibility.
That's what was going on. Yes, that's what
every government has bribed or tried to bribe people.
You can't bribe.
It's wrong.
I'm going to end the conversation there by saying you can't bribe people with their own money. It's just logically inconsistent. But speaking of the Treasury, leaked documents seen by Bloomberg have revealed that Treasury officials warned the Prime Minister that tax cuts would do little for the British economy and instead wanted to increase immigration and planning reform. Planning reform is very important to grow the economy. While there's little about this that it's surprising, it gives an insight into the blob-like thinking that dominates the Treasury. I've often alluded to in the past, Treasury orthodoxy is essentially static, whereas human beings are dynamic. And thus the Treasury generally rules out tax cuts, but also favours mass migration. And while it's true that the more people you have in your country, the bigger the economy will be in total, that doesn't mean it will be bigger per capita. And in 2023, the per capita income of this country declined. Well, I'm joined now by a friend of the programme, Professor of Economics at King's College London, Jonathan Porritt. Jonathan, thank you for coming back on. Don't we see the dead hand of Treasury thinking in this leaked document?
I think that's somewhat unfair. There's some truth to it in that the Treasury, for quite understandable reasons, wants to find ways of boosting growth that don't involve making the public finances worse. And obviously, both increasing spending and cutting taxes, at least in the short term, do cost money. So what can boost growth without costing the government money? Answer, planning reform and immigration. And I think it's a bit unfair to saying those are static thinking because both planning reform and immigration can, if done right, boost growth both in the short term for static reasons, but also in the long term, if you get your immigration system and your planning system right, then they can boost growth in the long term as well.
I absolutely agree with you on planning reform. I mean, I think it's been one of the great failures of the British state over recent decades, let alone recent years, not to reform planning, and that's been a great burden that has held back growth. But if you look at the immigration and GDP per capita figures, and I am taking OBR figures for once, which aren't enormously reliable, but let's take them on this instance. GDP per capita will actually have shrunk in 2023, even though GDP will have grown, and that it's a question of getting in the right people who will actually boost GDP per capita rather than simply total GDP.
Well, indeed. And the post-Brexit immigration system, which is one of the very few areas where Brexit does appear actually to have boosted growth and to improve the performance of the British economy, was designed precisely for this. It was designed to prioritise higher paid workers and the skills that we need. And by and large, actually, the evidence is it's doing that. And indeed, if you look at the numbers, a lot of the people who have come in are either students helping to shore up the university system, or they're working in high-skilled jobs like IT and business services, or they're working in the social care system. And while those jobs are relatively low paid, if we're not prepared to pay care workers and indeed NHS workers more, then we fall back on immigration, because that is the alternative to letting the system collapse entirely. And while I personally don't think that's optimal, I put up care workers' salaries. The government clearly has no intention of doing that.
Well, actually, I agree with you on that. I think that if we're to see increased productivity, we need to pay British people in the care system more so that they will accept the jobs. I've never bought into this argument there are jobs the British simply won't do. There are definitely jobs the British won't do unless you pay them more.
So I think in social care, that's right, where the government holds down wages because it's the government putting in the funding. But then we, the taxpayer, have to be prepared. You know, some of your much vaunted headroom will have to go not on tax cuts, but actually on paying care workers more so that we can reduce our dependence on relatively low-paid people from abroad.
That's why we need a dynamic analysis of the economy rather than the static one. And the cut in corporation tax that George Osborne introduced was based on a dynamic study, and I think that was the first time the Treasury did it, and it actually worked. So it's which taxes and when. It's not all taxes at all times.
That's right. And to be fair, the OBR does say that the improvement to capital allowances that was introduced in the last budget will have a positive impact on growth over the medium to long term. So it is doing that dynamic analysis. It's also I think there are other areas, some of the marginal tax rates that result from the child benefit withdrawal and from high repayment levels on student loans. You could do quite a bit to improve the operation of the tax system that wouldn't cost that much money. But on immigration, on the whole, the new system, leaving aside the care workers element, which we've just discussed, the new system, it has indeed boosted immigration, but it's also boosted per capita GDP, as far as we can tell, because of the number of people who are coming in. They're relatively young, they're mostly working, and they're either students, which is good for the economy, or they're working one way or another, which again, by and large, tends to boost per capita GDP as well as GDP.
OK, well, thank you very much, Jonathan. Coming up, we'll be doing a State of the Nation victory lap to celebrate 10 years since David Cameron announced the Brexit referendum. Plus, we'll be discussing our monarch working too hard.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Wake up to the headlines with headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News is Britain's news channel, and now you can support it. All you have to do is scan that QR code that's up on your screen right now, or you can go to gbnews.com/support and become a GB News member. You'll have fantastic benefits. We're also going to organise special events where you as GB News members can meet the presenters, the on-screen faces. Scan the QR code or go to gbnews.com/support. Thank you so much.
Welcome back. We've been discussing tax cuts and the establishment's insistence on mass migration, and you've been sending in mail mogs. Douglas says, and I like Douglas's message, thank you. Dear Jacob, great show as always. The answer to tax cuts that do not increase inflation is to cut indirect tax. We must as well get rid of the 62% rate between 100,000 and 120,000 and give everyone a personal allowance. And Peter says, immigration has not made us richer. GDP per head has been flat over 20 years. The increased population has made the quality of life in the UK worse. Today marks exactly 10 years since David Cameron announced the news that if the Conservatives were elected in 2015, we would hold a referendum to leave the European Union. It's come, therefore, a day of legend and song that we should always celebrate, because today it's coincided with more EU whinging. It's been alleged that the Eurocrats are frustrated that the Prime Minister has not yet set a date for the general election, as it has supposedly disrupted a really exciting summit meeting that they're planning to have. So, while our general election date has nothing to do with them, it's a reminder of what we're missing: unelected, whinging bureaucrats propping up the rotten carcass of the neoliberal order. So, 10 years on from the announcement, nearly 8 years on from the referendum, and 4 years on from our departure, with the Germans well into their recession, I thought best to look back on Brexit with my distinguished panel. It is rather arrogant of them, for some really rather boring summit, to think they should be told the date of the general election before the Cabinet and the King, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, when we were in the European Union, did we have to sort of consult? Did the Prime Minister have to consult them in those days about when he was or she was planning an election? It's very odd. Yeah,
but is it, Jacob, a true story?
Yes.
Firstly, it's in the Daily Express, and then there's a quote from you. Now, nothing wrong with that. But was it? Wow, I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This is appalling. I've heard this stuff. Or did they say, hello, Jacob?
It's a very well-sourced Daily Express story.
Jacob. Well,
but isn't it just a little reminder of how lucky we are? We're not in control of our own destiny. Yes, we do.
Oh, come
on. We know it from the Daily Express. Very reliable paper of record.
Not anymore.
No, it has been, yes. I mean, great history of the Daily Express.
Well, of course. But come on. It's one of those non-stories.
10 years since David Cameron, now Foreign Secretary, announced that referendum.
Good man.
Do you think he looks back on that decision with pride?
Yes, he does, because David Cameron did the right thing. He saw this bubbling up in the country, he saw it bubbling up within the Conservative Party, and something had to be done. Now, I was there with him for the launch of the campaign, you know, to stay within Europe. We got it wrong. We misjudged the view of the British people. But what did he do? He did the decent thing and resigned.
Michael, do you think it was the right thing to do? Do you think that having a referendum fits in with the British constitutional history?
I think that it's difficult to remember the pressure that Cameron was under, both from within his own party and awkward backbenchers like you, and there were growing numbers, almost by the day, and also lots of party members leaving, donations going to you, and the rise of UKIP. I mean, people talk about, Reform right now. Reform are doing pathetically compared with UKIP at the time. UKIP were getting to 20-30% in by-elections. They won a couple after the Bloomberg speech. You can understand why he was terrified. And I suspect Cameron thought, well, we'll probably get elected with the Lib Dems again. We probably won't get a majority. I can always count on them to veto it. Yes. And, of course, that never happened. And then he made the foolish error of holding the referendum quickly to get it out of the way, and did so at a time when migration across the Mediterranean was at huge levels and causing huge concerns without Europe. And I think without that, he probably would have won the referendum. I think it was also an element by 2015 that he thought, I can walk on water. I've won the AV referendum on the alternative voting system. I won the Scottish referendum. I got a majority in 2015, surprisingly perhaps. I can easily win this one.
But Jacob, a question for you. Here's Nigel Farage. We like Nigel. I disagree just about most of what he says, but I like him. We get on well. Just say he stands in a seat, just say he wins, and just say he's a member of Parliament, and just say he's allowed back as a Conservative member. Would you vote for him as leader?
Well, this is the most hypothetical.
That was not a denial. That's not a denial.
What is it if ifs and ands were pots and pans, there'd be no need to tinker?
Not a denial.
That is the most extraordinary leap of logic. But
I think the other thing about it, by the way, is the referendum would never have worked if it wasn't for the fact that the Labour Party was so pathetic in standing up for what they believed in, and Corbyn, who claimed to vote Remain, I don't think he did personally.
Well, I think Jeremy Corbyn is a great hero of Brexit, actually.
Didn't come out, and the Labour Party didn't come out and argue for it. And I think, when the indictment sheet is drawn up, they should be on it as much as the Conservatives.
The best speech on Brexit was from Peter Shaw, actually. If you look at this, absolutely right. The Labour minister, everyone thought he was going to be
the 75 referendum. But rather a long time before.
But one final thought on that. It seemed to me David Cameron followed the Harold Wilson playbook. Get a renegotiation, say this is a big change, put it to the people, expect to win.
Yes.
He made two mistakes. One is that he hadn't done the groundwork first. The second, Wilson didn't campaign. Wilson rose above it.
Yes.
And David Cameron got into the guts of it, and that made it impossible for him to carry on afterwards.
That's right. Wilson made hardly a speech, I think, in 75.
Yeah,
but I don't think Cameron would have wanted to carry on and actually carry out Brexit, would he? I mean,
no, because that's why it was right that he resigned.
All right.
He couldn't do that.
Well, the Foreign Secretary is very popular with my panel, and indeed with me. So thank you to my panel. We'll see them again next week. Next, we'll be asking if our king simply works too hard, plus whether the weather is fine or whether the weather is not. It's certain, however, the weather will weather, whether we like it or not. And it'll be fine in Somerset.
On Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 till 11 p.m, I speak to Britain's strictest head teacher, Catherine Birbalsingh. What happened on the day of the bomb threat, then?
Well...
She opens up about being taken to court for banning Muslim prayer rooms.
But I do think that if a school's ethos is such, and building is such, that they cannot have a prayer room, then they should be allowed to not have a prayer room.
It's a landmark legal case that will have enormous ramifications on the future of Britain.
All of us need to make sacrifices for the betterment of the whole so that we can all get on.
Is multiculturalism failing? Find out on a special Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 till 11 p.m. Be there.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests, and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. We've been discussing the glory of Brexit, and you've been getting in touch, and Elizabeth makes a very good point. We should always be grateful to Lord Cameron for giving us the referendum. I can't see a continental PM doing it or being able to do it. This, not homosexual marriage, should be his proudest boast. Well, His Majesty the King will reportedly be back up and running in no time after he undergoes a minor operation for an enlarged prostate. However, sources close to the palace have said the Queen has warned the King that he needs to slow down. Now, a subject would never dare suggest His Majesty should start working from home, but it does seem that since the royal family are now at only 2 full-time working members, they have a staffing problem. Should the royal family branch out into their lineage to alleviate some of the workload from the King? Well, with me is one of England's leading royal experts and biographer, Angela Levin. Angela, thank you for coming in.
Thank you for inviting me.
The King is very determined to work hard, isn't he?
Yes.
He's a very dutiful sovereign.
Yes. It goes all the way back to him to being a very, very young man. He didn't know what he was supposed to do as the heir to the throne. He could have gone on an island and drunk lots of nice drinks with little umbrellas in, you know, and had a wonderful time doing nothing. But that's not him. In his genes and in his blood, he likes to be working hard. So he worked up how he could make the heir to the throne have a decent life and work very hard for the country.
And dutiful work by the royal family is the essence of it, isn't it?
Yes.
That it's being there, it's being seen, it's that feeling that the subject is touched by Majesty, either by the King directly or by members of his family, and therefore being out and about, as the late Queen said, that she had to be seen to be believed. Being out and about is fundamental to the success.
Well, we heard that with the problem about when he said what was the matter, which is very unusual for anybody to say before they have the operation. And all the charities that deal with this said that the things went up by thousands. People calling in, looking after, you know, asked for the symptoms and all that sort of thing. So you can see how much influence he has, even in a sort of quiet way.
And Queen Camilla saying to him that he needs to work a little bit less?
I laughed about that because I did her biography, and she got 1 O-level. That was before GCSEs. She wasn't brought up to do any hard work, so she liked reading books, which she still adores, and she likes going to parties and drinking wine. And she never had any idea that she wanted to work hard. But the first thing she did was osteoporosis because her grandmother suffered. And she suddenly thought, she realised that she could be helpful. And so she's also almost obsessed by working. She's got loads of charities. She works incredibly hard. Throughout the pandemic, she was working on phones and remotely, especially dealing with things that the royal family wouldn't even look at, like domestic violence. And so she's actually, it's a sort of something that she began to like, and she's liked more and more as she's worked hard. So it's very hard for her to say to King Charles, you know, please cut it down.
Cut it down. But when you've got the King going into hospital, the Princess of Wales in hospital, the Prince of Wales visiting the Princess in hospital, the Duke of Edinburgh, I think, is in St Helena, so he's quite a long way away. That just leaves the Princess Royal and the Queen carrying out royal duties. It only leaves them as the effective councillors of state. Does the royal family need to bring in more remote members so that it has that touch that it had with the Duke of Kent and the Duke of Gloucester, who still carry out between them into the hundreds of engagements every year?
Well, Princess Anne is somebody to always go to. She always has time. She doesn't mind if the press don't come. She wants to work. She's very, very businesslike, and she's absolutely marvellous to have. But she's of an age into her 70s that makes it quite difficult. I think it's something that's OK in theory, but in practice it's quite hard, because can you trust people not to say too many things to the people in America?
Right,
the couple in America, it has to be very careful because they don't want anything leaked that will cause even more problems.
But the slimmed-down monarchy does create this problem.
Yes.
And, I mean, I've spoken to people over the years who went to an event with the Duke of Kent or Princess Alexandra 30 years ago, and they remember it, they loved it. It was an incredibly powerful way of the late Queen spreading her touch of majesty.
I'm sure they would do a bit, but I think it's quite difficult. I think Prince Andrew's daughters are very reliable, both of them, particularly Beatrice. But, you know, if they're still friendly with Harry, then it's a problem. They could do the work, but would they keep absolutely stum and not say anything about it? Because he has to be very careful, doesn't want to stir anything up. But also, you know, you have to be very careful.
And what
he's
about
doing
the Princess Royal's children? Could they do more? I mean, they don't have formal royal titles, but they could always be given them.
I think they could do some work, yes, particularly with charities, because they're lively and bright. Zara is absolute delight, as is her husband. It's an example of someone who comes from an ordinary home, who's fitted in very well with the monarchy and come closer to William and Catherine. And I think they would be good, because they're very good with the public.
And they've done very well in Australia.
Very well with Australia.
Well, Angela, thank you very much indeed. Yesterday, the Meteorological Office teamed up with the Irish Meteorological Service to provide our latest storm with the name Jocelyn. Jocelyn is the 10th storm of the storm naming season, and like his predecessors, he begins life accompanied by a warning. But are all of these warnings becoming excessive? Yesterday saw the Meteorological Office forecasted advising us to stay away from glass windows and to stay in rooms where there is no chimney stack above. It made it difficult for me to stay at home, really, under those circumstances. Well, joining us to discuss this is the legendary broadcaster and former Met officer and BBC weather presenter, John Ketley. Well, thank you very much for joining me. Do you think this is all getting a little bit over the top and we're getting a little bit wet? Well, in all senses.
Not the best phrase, that one, really, Jacob, was it? But, yeah, it has been said before. I don't think it is at the moment, because we did have a very serious storm yesterday. This was Isha, of course. And although, you know, not many people suffered too much directly, it did influence travelling around the country. I know the trains were stopped very quickly so that there wasn't any problem going north into Scotland. And it's the same situation again tonight as well. I think we have to be fairly cautious with these storms because, you know, they are life-threatening. There's no doubt about that. And one of the issues at the moment, I think, and it's been going on now for several weeks through the winter, is that the river levels, as we can see now on the pictures, the river levels are very high. And many places now have got swollen rivers, flooded, waterlogged fields by the side of the rivers. Many houses are getting more and more waterlogged as well outside in the gardens. And so it is very difficult, and there are issues all around the country. We know now this evening York again has flooded. And that's a regular occurrence, of course. It happens every year in these winter storms. But yes, we are getting a lot of storms this year, but last year we had 2 named storms, so not every year is the same.
But there's a great piece in the Telegraph that I've read that says there have been fewer occurrences of maximum gust speeds exceeding 40, 50 and 60 knots in the last 2 decades compared to the 1980s and the 1990s. And I just wonder if we're getting too nervous that yes, of course there are storms, and we always see those pictures of Tewkesbury Abbey, which never floods when everything around it does, because the medieval forebears knew how to build things in the right place, which we may not be so good at. And yet this always happens, and it's getting a sense of perspective about it.
Yeah, there's a little bit of nanny-ish, isn't there, going on, but, you know, I'm crusty now, fairly crusty. I've been doing this job for many, many years, and I do remember issues going back into the 70s and 80s and 90s, as you referred to, where probably conditions were far worse. We had a very, very serious, really damaging and life-threatening storm at the beginning of 1976, right at the beginning of January that year. And in 1968, we had the big storm across in Scotland and Northern England. That killed many people in Glasgow, for example. Lots of buildings were completely flattened in Glasgow in 1968 in January. So we have seen these sort of conditions, if not worse, in decades gone.
In the past.
Well, yeah, in the past. So I'm not belittling it. It is a pretty nasty storm again.
Thank you very much, John. Next time you come on, I'll have to ask you why Somerset has the best weather of anywhere in the world, which my viewers will already be aware of. But thank you very much for joining me this evening. That's it from me. Up next, it's Patrick Christie's. Patrick, what's on your bill of fare tonight?
Jacob, I've got a massive interview with Catherine Birbalsingh, who is running this school that's been dragged into the High Court for refusing to bend to the will of fundamentalist Islam. Jacob, I've got to ask, though, we need to keep it GB News tonight because apparently Sir Simon Clarke is about to call for a new Prime Minister this evening. How do you feel about that?
It's a very interesting question. Let's see what happens. I think we'll have to wait for his statement, if that's a statement that he's going to make.
OK, well, hey, there you go. It looks like it is going to break on my show tonight, so make sure you keep it GB News. Great show, Jacob. Sorry to put you on the spot there.
That's all right. That's what I'm here for. That's coming up after the weather. I'll be back tomorrow at 8 o'clock. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation. There's a thing on your screen. Look at that. If you live in Lincolnshire, get in touch and come to the People's Forum in Scunthorpe, which I'm having next week on the 1st of February. We are bursting the Westminster bubble and getting out to Lincolnshire, a very fine county, lived in by somebody I'm related to, who comes on this programme from time to time, who you may remember. The weather, of course, coming up. Somerset will be glorious. Storms just skirt around it and stay in Wiltshire and Devon and Dorset and places like that.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, it's Aidan McGivern here from the Met Office with the GB News forecast. Storm Jocelyn sweeps through overnight, increasingly windy with heavy showers.